Hello, I'm Ross, I work at Rive, and today I'm going to be talking about blend states. Now, what are blend states? Well, let me give you an example. I have a circle. If I open up animate mode, I can open up a timeline and just create a keyframe and pop the circle at the top of the screen. And I'll call this timeline top. Then I can duplicate that timeline and call this one bottom. Then I can change the position of the circle and put it at the bottom of the screen. Now, a typical simple thing to do in Rive is to transition between animations using a input. I'm going to use a number input. So to go from top to bottom, I will set the condition to be that the number has to be 1. And then to go in the opposite direction, I'll set the condition that the number has to be 0. So if I press play, I can change that number input and transition between the two keyframe values. I can also highlight the conditions and add a duration of 500 milliseconds. I can add some easing to the transition, and then if I press play, we can transition between the keyframe values in a smooth way. But even though this is nice, this is still not a blend state. A blend state allows you to have much more control about where you are in the transition. So let's set one up. I'll just delete this one, highlight this one, and set it to a blend state. Then I will set the input to the number input, and then add 2 timelines. The first one I'll set to top, and the second one I'll set to bottom, and then on the bottom one I will set the number to be 100. So as you can see here, when we press play, if the number is 0, we are seeing the keyframe value for the top timeline, and when the number is 100, we're seeing the keyframe value for the bottom timeline. However, if the number was traveling in between 0 or 100, what we're doing is traveling in between the keyframe values. The keyframe values are blending together. A more complex example would be this walk cycle, and then I have another walk cycle that has the exact same timing, but I've accentuated the keyframe values. So I'm animating the exact same properties in both walk cycles. However, one is more extreme than the other. And I can go back into my state machine and create a blend state out of those 2 walk cycles. And if I press play, I can transition slowly between the keyframe values. However, what I actually want to do is create a slider that controls this number. How do I do this? Well, first of all, highlight your number and make sure that it is exposed to the parent artboard. Click this box true. Then I'm going to create another artboard, tap N to nest an artboard, drag it into place, and now if I open up animate mode and open a timeline, highlight the nested artboard and go over here, and you'll see that we can actually set keyframes for that number input. So at the beginning of the timeline, go ahead and set this to 0, and then go to the end of the timeline, tap U, and then set it to 100. Press play and you can see that the animations are blending together over 1 second. And now what we can do is create a slider here, and we can actually set that slider to retime this timeline. And in doing so, we will be controlling what number the number input is set to. So let's create our slider. First, I'm going to draw a rectangle, change it to have round corners, and set the background to black. Then I'll create a circle, move it into place, and then set that circle to white. Next, I'm going to change the artboard background just so we can see things a bit clearer. And next, I'm actually going to group this ellipse in its own group. And I'll tell you why in a second. I'll call this circle group. Now, tap Tab, go to the state machine and create a listener. And if you already have the layer selected, when you create your listener, it will automatically be targeting that layer, which is exactly what we want. I want to be targeting the circle group and then set this to pointer move. So if my pointer is moving over the circle, I'll just get rid of this. I want to align the target, and the target I want to align is the circle group itself. So the listener is basically saying if my pointer moves on the circle group, then the circle group should follow my pointer. So if I press play, nothing happens because I haven't actually moved my pointer over the circle group yet. But if I do, then the circle follows my mouse. However, if I move my pointer too quickly, my pointer actually escaped the vicinity of the circle, and so the circle is no longer following my cursor. This is why I actually put the ellipse in a group. what we're going to do is duplicate the ellipse and increase its size, delete its fill, and this bigger ellipse is actually going to serve as a hitbox. So even though the ellipse is only this big, the circle group itself is now this big. So if I press play and I hover over it, it's now following my mouse, and even if I move my mouse quite quickly, my cursor cannot escape the hitbox. Now, because this is a slider, I don't want the circle group to be able to go any lower than this, and I don't want it to be able to go any higher than that. I also don't want it to be able to move on the x-axis. How do I do this? Well, with constraints. Click plus translation. And what a translation constraint does is just controls the position. So if I go into the settings, I can set the target to be the rectangle, and right now it is copying the X position of the rectangle and the Y position of the rectangle. I don't want it to copy the Y position, so I'll just check that off. However, I still do want it to copy the X, because if it's copying the X position, that means it stays within the X position of that slider. And now, with the animation playing, I will just put my circle up to the top and just move my mouse off of it. Go into the settings, and we're going to set a minimum Y position. Let me just increase this, and as I increase it, you'll see that the circle actually goes down. This is because the height of the canvas actually starts at 0 up here and then increases as you go down. So as I'm increasing this minimum height, the circle is actually traveling down the canvas. I want the minimum height to line up to the top of the slider. I'll tap enter. And now this circle can only reach the top of the slider and no further. And now I'm going to add a maximum height. So I'll put my circle down here, go into the settings, click max, and then I'll increase this to there, click away, and now my circle cannot escape my slider. A good thing about having a hitbox of this specific size means that the cursor can come in, move the slider, and then the cursor can just leave, and the slider just stays where it's left. So now what I'm going to do is hook this slider up to a Rive slider, which will be just over here, and that Rive slider will control the timing of this timeline, and this timeline is controlling the number input for this nested artboard. Let me show you how. So go into design mode, and up here, drop down, and then create a joystick. I will put my joystick over here. Now, I actually want my joystick to have 0 width, so we can only move the handle up and down and not left and right. And I want to set the handle source to be the circle group. So now, if I go into the state machine and press play and adjust the slider, the handle has been constrained to the position of the circle group. Now, at the top of the slider, I actually want the handle to be hitting the top, so I need to shrink this joystick down a little bit. Okay, cool. So the joystick handle is reaching both ends. That's great. And now what I can do is highlight the joystick and go to Y-axis, and then we can set a timeline. I only have one, so I'll select timeline 1. And now if I press play, the slider being in this position is playing the wonky walk, and then the slider being up here is playing the normal walk. Because, once again, what the slider and joystick are doing is controlling the timing of this timeline. As I adjust the slider, this blue line is moving backwards and forwards along this timeline, and this timeline is controlling the number input for our nested artboard. Now, if I wanted to reverse the order of these timelines, all I'd have to do is just highlight the joystick and go over here to invert. And now it is the calm walk that appears first, and then when I raise it up, it's the wonky walk. And that is how you control a blend state using a slider.